What if the face of evil was not a mythical creature but a human living among us? This question might be unsettling, but it's a reality that we cannot shy away from. Evil is not always a supernatural entity, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on the innocent. Sometimes it takes on a form that is much more familiar, much more terrifying. A human being. There's a name that sends chills down the spine of those who know his story. Andrei Chikatilo. An ordinary man, a husband, a father, living an ordinary life. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, there was something far from ordinary. Born in the throes of a war-torn country, Chikatilo's life was marked by hardship from the very beginning. He was an average student, a dutiful son, a quiet neighbor. But these ordinary facets of his life were just a camouflage, a way to blend into the crowd, to be just another face in the sea of humanity. The man we're about to delve into was not just a man. He was a monster. A monster who committed heinous, unthinkable crimes. We will not dive into the gory details just yet, but know this. The atrocities he committed were shocking, even to the most hardened of investigators. His acts were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment or a fit of rage. They were calculated, premeditated, and executed with a chilling precision that belied his apparent ordinariness. It's a horrifying reminder that sometimes the most monstrous of evils can hide behind the most mundane of faces. In this story, we'll peel back the layers of the man who was Andrei Chikatilo. We'll delve into his life, his psyche, and his monstrous transformation. We'll try to understand what made him the way he was and how he managed to evade capture for so long. But remember, this is not a tale for the faint of heart. It's a journey into the darkest corners of human nature. It's a journey into the life of Andrei Chikatilo, a seemingly ordinary man, yet behind the facade lurked a monster. Born in 1936 in the heart of Soviet Ukraine, Chikatilo's childhood was far from ordinary. He was raised during a time when the country was gripped by the iron fist of Stalin's regime, a period marred by famine, fear, and political oppression. Andrei Chikatilo was born into a world of poverty where food was scarce and survival was a daily struggle. His parents, both hardworking peasants, were barely able to put food on the table. Stories of his mother telling him about a brother he never met, who was allegedly taken and eaten during the famine, haunted his early years. These tales of cannibalism, whether true or not, planted a seed of horror in young Chikatilo's mind. He was often sickly as a child, suffering from chronic water retention, a condition that earned him the scorn of his peers and left him socially isolated. His physical ailments, coupled with the harsh realities of life in Soviet Ukraine, made his childhood a crucible of suffering. He became a target for bullies and often sought refuge in the world of books, a place where he could escape his grim reality. His academic prowess didn't go unnoticed. Despite his hardships, Chikatilo excelled in his studies, earning him a place in a vocational school, where he trained to be a communications technician. However, his inability to form meaningful relationships and his growing feelings of inadequacy led to a troubled adolescence. The seeds of his monstrous future were being sown in these early years. The hardship, the isolation, the tales of cannibalism, all these elements combined to create a fertile ground for the emergence of a dark persona. However, it's essential to remember that many children endure tough upbringings without turning into monsters. Chikatilo's childhood was a grim tapestry of hardship and horror, but it was not a blueprint for his future crimes. It's a chilling reminder, though, of how early experiences can shape an individual for better or worse. A troubled childhood, however, is not a justification for the horrors that were to come. As Chikatilo grew older, the seeds of evil within him began to sprout. His adolescence and early adulthood were marked by struggles, particularly with impotence. This deeply personal issue was not merely a source of embarrassment for him, but also a catalyst for the dark path he was about to tread. In his early 20s, Chikatilo took on the role of a teacher. It was a position of authority and respect, a platform from which he could guide young minds. However, for Chikatilo, this was not an opportunity to inspire, but to exploit. His twisted mind saw his students not as individuals to nurture, but as victims to prey upon. The classroom, a sanctuary of learning, became his hunting ground. Chikatilo's first job as a teacher marked the beginning of his criminal activities. He used his position to manipulate his students, drawing them into a web of fear and control. His actions were not spontaneous, but calculated, a cold and methodical approach to his horrific deeds. The man who was supposed to protect and educate was instead the perpetrator of unthinkable harm. His struggles with impotence only fueled his desire to dominate and control. It was a vicious cycle, a downward spiral that only deepened his descent into darkness. The more he struggled with his own inadequacies, the more he sought to exert power over others. His victims, young and vulnerable, bore the brunt of his frustrations. It was at this point in his life that Chikatilo's monstrous nature began to truly reveal itself. His actions were no longer the result of a troubled childhood or personal struggles. They were the manifestations of a deeply ingrained evil, an insatiable hunger for power and control. Chikatilo had begun his descent into darkness, and there was no turning back. His path was set, his fate sealed. The man who once stood in front of a classroom tasked with shaping young minds had instead chosen to leave a trail of pain and suffering in his wake. From 1978 to 1990, Chikatilo unleashed a reign of terror unlike any other. This 12-year period marked the most active and horrific phase of his criminal career. Known as the Rostov Ripper, this name was a chilling testament to the sheer terror he inflicted in the hearts of the Rostov region's inhabitants. During this time, he committed a series of heinous crimes that shook the nation to its very core. Chikatilo was not a random killer. He had a specific type of victim he preyed upon: young, vulnerable individuals, often runaways or children from troubled homes. They were easy targets, lured by the promise of assistance or a friendly face. This careful selection of victims allowed him to operate with impunity for years. The number of victims attributed to Chikatilo is staggering: 53 confirmed cases, though the actual number is suspected to be much higher. Each one a life cut short, a family left in mourning, a community left in fear. However, it's important to remember that these were not just numbers. They were human beings, each with a story that was abruptly and brutally ended. Chikatilo's methods were brutal and calculated. He would gain the trust of his victims, lure them into secluded areas, and then, when they were most vulnerable, he would strike. His method of killing was a perverse mix of violence and manipulation, a testament to his sadistic nature. Yet, despite the gruesome nature of his crimes, it's crucial not to dwell excessively on these horrifying details. The focus should be on the victims, the lives lost, and the impact on the community. It's a stark reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, concealed behind the mask of a seemingly ordinary man. For over a decade, the people of Rostov lived in fear, their lives overshadowed by the monstrous acts of one man. But like all reigns of terror, this one too had to come to an end. Over a decade of horror, and the monster was finally captured. Chikatilo's reign of terror was over, but the scars he left behind would forever mark the history of Rostov. In 1992, the trial of Andrei Chikatilo began, marking the end of his reign. The courtroom was a scene of abject horror and fascination, as the atrocities committed by Chikatilo were laid bare. The crowd, a mix of grieving relatives, curious onlookers, and a rabid press, watched on with bated breath as the gruesome details unfolded. Chikatilo, dubbed by the media as the Butcher of Rostov, stood in the dock, seemingly unfazed. He was charged with the murder of 53 people, mostly young women and children, over a 12-year period. His crimes, unspeakable in their brutality, had held the entire Soviet Union in a grip of fear. As the trial progressed, the public reaction was one of mixed horror, disgust, and relief. The horror and disgust were directed at the monstrous acts committed by Chikatilo, while the relief was due to the fact that the reign of this terrifying figure was finally at an end. The courtroom echoed with cries of anguish from the victims' families and calls for justice from the public. 2 years after his trial in 1994, Chikatilo met his fate. He was executed, bringing an end to the saga of one of the most notorious serial killers in history. His death, however, did little to alleviate the pain and suffering of his victims' families. Their lives had been irrevocably altered by his actions, and they were left with the daunting task of picking up the pieces. In the aftermath of Chikatilo's crimes, the society was left to grapple with the chilling reality of the evil that had lived among them. His story served as a sobering reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink when driven by twisted desires and unchecked power. Andrei Chikatilo, a man whose life was a chilling testament to the evil that humans are capable of. His name, forever etched in infamy, continues to cast a long, dark shadow over the annals of criminal history.